Hello, this is Ty Newell, and this is COVID status report number 4 with data as of April 2nd, and today is April 3rd. In today's report, as we look at different countries, there's some optimistic news. Even though we still see the US continuing to streak up in infections, and by the time of this report, moving past 250,000 infections, buried within this data is some good news as far as trends within hard-hit New York and hard-hit Washington, and we'll take a look at that. Overall, other countries such as Italy, as we're seeing, are starting to gain control, and as we look at our infections parameter, we'll see that it looks like they are going to be able to stabilize, although as we continue to stress, it's a continuing struggle. Looking at our infections parameter, the parameter that describes for an individual who on average is infected for a period of about 14 days, and then whether or not they know they're sick or infected, but the number of infections over that time period that they may have passed on, that we see South Korea continuing to hold at a level of about little more than 2. Italy has joined them with a similar level. France, as I noted, this data, sometimes the data comes in a little late, sometimes it comes in a little early, sometimes both. And so that can cause some of these jumps rather than this being, say, a real jump up to 10 to 12 infections per infected um, shown in their data. But I think that France, on the whole, is somewhere in that range of 2 to 3, and we'll see as the data continues. And Germany continuing to hang into that 3 to 4 range on the infections parameter, and hopefully we'll start seeing that move back down again. But it's a struggle. It's a really difficult battle to gain control and then to keep things moving in the right direction. Iran is looking continually better, working their way down below an infection parameter of 4, and hopefully they will keep that trend going. The US and the UK uh, still showing a fairly level of infection parameter of about 6. And although that's much more than we desire, this is buried within this data as we take a look at the US is some good news. And so we'll see what's behind this infection parameter a bit. If you're a betting person, and those of you in the US that miss March Madness or the Kentucky Derby, perhaps you want to form a pool to see who has the lowest infection parameter each day. And then with those winnings, perhaps those could be donated to medical personnel in your community, unemployed or underemployed folks in your community, uh, food banks and soup kitchens in your community. But maybe you can figure out something good to do while having some fun with your friends. As of today, as of April 2nd's data, France won with a level of 1.9. South Korea and Italy tied at 2.4, and Spain moving into third place with 3.3, but Iran is right behind them with 3.5. Another point has been added to this plot. This circle, we started down here, and I did a projected prediction of where we could end up if we do not improve. This is an infection parameter of 7, and where the US roughly looks like about 6, that will be somewhat lower, but still at an unacceptably high level of infections over the course of the next month. The reason why we have this series of 4 to 5 days is that there's a 4 to 5 day latent period while the infection is incubating. And so in the model that I put together, that's taken account with these first few data points. And in 1 or 2 more days, we'll reach this point. And it's beyond this point that we'll then start seeing if actions that were taken a couple weeks ago, but then had the incubation period, whether or not we can start getting them on, hopefully, this trend with an infection parameter of 1.5, or perhaps maybe 2. And as we've seen with many countries, that's very doable, and get away from this level of 6 to 7. So we talked about 10 to 11 to 12 million infections is about 100 to 120,000 deaths, although maybe significantly more than that, as we're seeing a fatality level greater than 1% in many regions. So we'll see what happens. And then again, all the confusing information that's coming out, it's not confusing. Wear the mask. A sneeze, a cough cloud blows 20 to 30 feet from that person who's not wearing a mask. That could have stopped that sneeze cloud and cough cloud from moving past your eyes and putting the infection in your eyes, moving the infected cloud past your nose, where it can then be inhaled. Wear the mask. Just a brief state view. So similar plots to before, and I left South Korea on for perspective because its infection rate is similar to where many of our states are now, New York being the exception. But while New York on this left-hand plot has had this very uncontrolled, very accelerated growth in infections, when we look at the infection parameter applied to these different states, and the state data is pretty rough data, and it's hard to get data 3 weeks ago, which is needed to develop this infection parameter. New York and Washington, as our earliest states with significant infections, their data is more reliable and more mature, and so the infection parameter is better behaved, where Georgia and Illinois, a little bit later, but now in a fairly high growth range, that the data is a little bit noisier, but it will settle down over the next week or so. What we see in this data, when we look at Korea, as we've discussed, its infection parameter is around 2. And at about 2, it is at least, even though it hasn't been snuffed out, at a level where we should be able to gain control, where recoveries start to outpace infections, and we start getting our medical personnel, our staff, and our supplies into a range that we can control. When we look at New York, as difficult as it has been there on the infection parameter, you can see that they have made steady progress, and New Yorkers are now getting down to a level of 4. Tremendous progress. And as we look at Washington, we see even better as they've dropped below an infection parameter of 2. So they are about at the level where it's no longer self-sustaining. But again, this can flare up at any time as an infection from anyone coming in that's undetected and spread around, can again get this thing to start taking off like wildfire. But we look at Georgia and Illinois, and you can see that we're on the upside of what this average current US infection parameter of 6 is at. And so some states are doing better, notably New York and Washington, and others like Georgia, Illinois, Michigan, we've got a ways to go to get this in control. And this makes a very important point, though. You may be in a state, you may be in a city or a region where isolation, distancing, wearing masks is not taken seriously. You have no leadership that's helping you to understand the importance of taking these measures, but you can take it on yourself. As I stated a couple of reports ago, ideally, if every one of us went into an isolation bubble with zero contact with anyone else, this thing would snuff itself out in 2 to 3 weeks, and it would be gone. It would no longer exist. Now, we're not in a perfect world where that can happen. So, some folks, like our brave medical personnel and our essential services, that they're on the front lines, are getting infected faster than all of us. And the more we can do to minimize what they're having to deal with, the better for them. But if you're in an area that is not seriously, that is not proactively trying to control this at this point, you can still do that within your house, within your neighborhood, within the community around you. Isolate it, be serious about it, protect yourselves, and as this wave of infection blows through your community, you can have small islands that are protected and safe. And then once the infection has passed, that you can come out and intermingle, and hopefully we get on to life as we know it. So I went to Walmart this morning. You can see me wearing my mask heading into Walmart. And only 2 people said, "Hey, freak," when I was walking in there. But I'd like to let you know that that's actually pretty good. Without the mask, I hear that much more often. Um, you can also see me at the checkout counter. I'm taking, actually, there's a selfie of myself up in the security camera. But there's a lady coming in with a mask. And by my estimate, I tend to go early in the morning, so it's not crowded. But by my estimate, about 10% of the folks here are wearing masks. And I think that that's just about at the point where it's going to take off. Now, you see this T-shirt I'm wearing that says "Resistance is futile," and you Star Trek fans will recognize that saying. This T-shirt, and then this guy down below with the penetrating stare, they're related. More than 20 years ago, the University of Illinois had an engineering team that developed a solar-powered car called the Photon Torpedo. It competed in the Sun Race, a race of several universities from Indianapolis to Colorado Springs, about 1,000-mile journey, driving these solar-powered cars. And this fellow down below, Neil Kashkari, who may look familiar to some of you, but he was an engineering student and actually the team captain for the Photon Torpedo. And he's now the president of the Federal Reserve of the Bank of Minneapolis. I know he looks like he's probably good buddies with Dr. Evil, but he's actually a very, very nice person, excellent character, very intelligent. And my point is that as we move on to the economic side of things, that and we wonder who these people are with the Federal Reserve or in other areas, there are some really, really good people. Now, Neil was in the press quite a bit in the 2008 meltdown as he was put in charge of the $700 billion TARP funding. And so he was often derided in the news as Neil Cash and Carry and the $700 billion man. But when I saw that he was the person put in charge of that program, I felt relieved knowing that there's somebody that who's of good character and he's in public service for the right reasons. So as you may see his face on Bloomberg or other business shows, um, I hope you understand that, there are some good people in there, despite, what we often are seeing on our news. Finally, use the mask, stay home, and again, support and thank all of those who are helping us through this time. Goodbye.